You think you can walk in here and go unnoticed. The words cut through the quiet of the courtroom like a sudden winter chill, and every eye in the room instinctively shifted. The courtroom was vast, its tall ceilings echoing with the faint hum of the ventilation system and the soft scrape of shoes across polished hardwood floors. Sunlight streamed in through the high windows, casting sharp rectangles of light onto the rows of benches where spectators sat, their eyes flicking between the figures at the center of the room. Representative Alicia Brooks stood poised near the witness stand, her posture straight, her shoulders relaxed but firm, a subtle signal of authority that contrasted with the tense atmosphere around her. She adjusted the cuff of her blazer with a quiet grace, letting the movement serve as a silent assertion that she belonged, that she had every right to be here. Across the room, Officer Greg Hanson straightened in his uniform, his brow furrowing slightly as he eyed Alicia with a mixture of irritation and disbelief, the badge on his chest catching the sunlight and reflecting it like a small challenge. The murmurs of the audience swelled slightly as a few whispered comments drifted through the air, but Alicia did not flinch. Her eyes met his directly, steady and unyielding, a calmness that seemed almost tangible in the charged room. The judge's gavel rested idle on the bench, a silent witness to the building tension, the polished wood catching light from the side windows. The clerk shuffled papers in the corner, fingers tapping a soft rhythm against a stack of documents, adding to the muted soundtrack of anticipation. Alicia's mind was focused, noting the subtle movements of everyone around her, the shuffle of feet, the quiet clearing of throats, the shifting of weight on the benches, all the micro-cues that told her the room was aware of the unspoken conflict unfolding at the center. Officer Hanson took a cautious step closer, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the hushed audience, a statement that seemed meant to assert control but instead highlighted his uncertainty. Alicia held her ground, the faintest hint of a nod acknowledging the unspoken tension, a signal that she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Outside the courtroom, the sun shone warmly on the city streets, a stark contrast to the cool, filtered light. Inside, where every movement was amplified, every glance charged with meaning, Alicia's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the stand, a small, controlled gesture, yet one that seemed to draw the attention of those watching without a single word being spoken. The murmurs softened, replaced by a tense silence as all eyes lingered on the scene, waiting for the next move, the room holding its collective breath. She took a measured step forward, each movement deliberate, unhurried, radiating a quiet confidence that seemed to ripple through the space around her, settling into the rows of spectators, and even reaching the judge, who lifted his gaze momentarily, eyebrows raised in subtle curiosity. The soft creak of the floor beneath her shoes was a stark reminder of the weight of each step, the history of the building, and the centuries of authority it had witnessed. Officer Hanson shifted his stance slightly, his hands tightening at his sides, a hint of the unease creeping into his posture despite the uniform and the badge that had once made him feel untouchable. Alicia's eyes scanned the room briefly, noting the micro-expressions, the flickers of surprise and anticipation on the faces surrounding her, and she allowed herself a faint, composed exhale, the air flowing quietly around her, as if signaling that she was in control, that she had prepared for every eventuality. The tension built slowly, an almost imperceptible pressure, until it reached a point where the room seemed to lean forward, collectively waiting, the soft rhythm of breathing and faint shifting of papers punctuating the anticipation. And in that moment, the slightest smile touched Alicia's lips, not a smirk, not an expression of triumph, but a quiet signal that she was ready, that every expectation of imbalance, every miscalculation of power, had already been accounted for in her mind, and the room, silent and attentive, seemed to recognize it too. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the seconds stretched, the faint hum of the ventilation blending with the subtle shuffle of papers on the judge's bench. Alicia Brooks moved with a deliberate, measured grace, each step echoing softly on the polished floor, her eyes scanning the rows of observers with calm scrutiny. Officer Greg Hanson adjusted his tie nervously, the polished leather of his shoes squeaking slightly against the hardwood as he shifted weight from one foot to the other, the badge on his chest catching the late morning sunlight, filtering through the tall windows. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, some whispering to neighbors, others holding their breath, the tension in the room rising as if charged by an unseen current. Alicia's gaze remained fixed on the officer, steady and unyielding, the slightest tilt of her head suggesting awareness without aggression. She reached subtly for her briefcase at her side, her fingers brushing over the edges of the leather, a controlled gesture that spoke of preparation and presence of mind, of readiness for whatever might come next. The judge, an imposing figure perched on the elevated bench, cleared his throat softly, his gavel resting beside him, a silent reminder of the weight of law and observation. And yet the authority in the room seemed suspended in the subtle dance of anticipation between the two figures at center stage. Officer Hanson exhaled slowly, a faint clenching of his fists betraying his inner unease, and Alicia noticed without a flicker of surprise, her posture unchanged, a quiet testament to her training and confidence. She shifted her weight slightly, the movement graceful, almost imperceptible, yet it drew the attention of a few onlookers who sensed the calm intensity radiating from her. The ambient light cast shadows that danced across the polished surfaces, elongating the figures and lending an almost cinematic quality to the tense moment. The clerk at the side shuffled a stack of files, the faint rustle of paper punctuating the silence, while the spectators remained suspended, caught in the delicate balance of anticipation and the possibility of sudden revelation. Alicia allowed her eyes to sweep across the courtroom once more, noting the subtle changes in posture, the tiny shifts in attention, the micro-expressions that conveyed surprise, curiosity, and apprehension, a silent map of human emotion unfolding in response to the controlled energy she radiated. Officer Hanson cleared his throat again, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room, and Alicia's gaze did not waver. She breathed in slowly, the air crisp and controlled, her chest rising in a measured rhythm, grounding herself and subtly signaling her unshakable composure to all who watched. Every detail mattered, the tilt of a head, the placement of hands, the minuscule movements that spoke volumes without a single word. The murmur of whispers from the back of the room softened too. Almost nothing, the audience collectively attuned to the tension, the anticipation, the unspoken question of what would unfold next. Alicia's slight smile was serene, controlled, hinting at knowledge and readiness rather than triumph, a quiet assertion of authority that filled the room without a sound. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching just enough for the weight of expectation to press against every shoulder, every chest, every attentive gaze. The sunlight caught the edge of the officer's badge again, reflecting and scattering light subtly across the room, while Alicia's shadow stretched long across the floor, grounding her presence and marking her domain. Every spectator felt the tension, the delicate balance between perceived power and the calm confidence that Alicia exuded, a silent but powerful lesson in control, patience, and awareness. The judge shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting papers and glancing over the edge of his glasses, yet even his movements were subdued by the growing anticipation emanating from the space between the two central figures. The soft creak of a bench echoed through the room, a reminder of the physical space holding the weight of human expectation, of a moment poised on the edge of revelation. Alicia's eyes met Officer Hanson's once more, unwavering, controlled, carrying a quiet command that the room instinctively recognized, a promise that the next moment, whatever it would be, was already calculated, anticipated, and owned by her calm presence. In the subtle stillness, the tension rippled outward, brushing over every person present, pulling attention like gravity to a focal point, where readiness, composure, and the silent assertion of authority converged into an almost tangible energy that filled the courtroom from wall to ceiling, from the judge's bench to the farthest row of seats, leaving all who observed acutely aware that the balance of power, though unspoken, was clearly in the hands of the one who knew exactly what to expect, and how to act with unshakable precision. The air in the courtroom remained taut, a nearly tangible weight pressing down on every witness, observer, and official present. Alicia Brooks shifted subtly, the faintest movement of her hands across the polished edge of the witness stand signaling control without breaking her composed demeanor. Officer Greg Hanson's eyes flickered nervously, his breathing shallow, each inhale and exhale sounding louder than it should in the quiet chamber. The sun had risen higher, streaming through the upper windows, and casting golden rectangles on the floor, illuminating the polished wood in stark contrast to the tense atmosphere, highlighting the minute details of each person's posture and gesture. Alicia's gaze swept across the room again, noting every subtle cue from the spectators, the judge, and the court officers, her mind calculating, observing, and preparing. Each step she took was deliberate, measured, her blazer moving with her body as she adjusted slightly to maintain poise, and the faint click of her heels echoed softly, punctuating the hushed environment. The murmurs of the audience, once whispered and tentative, softened further as the collective attention focused on the interaction unfolding, the unspoken anticipation almost vibrating in the air. Officer Hanson shifted on his feet, his fingers tightening unconsciously at his sides, the uniform seeming to grow heavier as the sense of scrutiny increased, his usual composure challenged by Alicia's calm, yet commanding presence. The judge shifted in his seat slightly, rustling papers, eyes flicking over the top of his glasses, yet the attention in the room remained anchored on the subtle but deliberate signals exchanged between the two central figures. Alicia extended her arms slightly, brushing the edge of the stand, a controlled gesture that drew in the eyes of the audience without a word spoken, each movement carrying the weight of intent and authority, a silent declaration of readiness. The soft hum of the building, the occasional shuffle of a shoe or movement of a clerk's fingers across documents, became amplified in the heightened awareness of the space, each small sound punctuating the moment and layering into the charged atmosphere. Alicia's posture remained impeccable, shoulders relaxed yet firm, chin slightly raised, eyes unyielding, radiating a calm energy that seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone in the room. Officer Hanson's gaze darted momentarily, betraying uncertainty, and Alicia noted each micro-expression, the subtle tension in his stance, the tiny shifts that indicated his awareness of being assessed, observed, and matched. Light played across the courtroom in narrow beams, casting shadows that elongated the figures and emphasized the subtle contrasts in height, posture, and presence, creating a visual rhythm that mirrored the rising anticipation. The crowd, now leaning slightly forward, seemed caught in the delicate balance of watching history unfold in microcosm, each person attuned to the unspoken dialogue, the anticipation of action, and the silent assertion of capability from Alicia. She allowed a faint, controlled exhale to escape, the motion imperceptible to some, monumental to others, grounding her in the moment and signaling complete readiness. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every calculated shift in weight was observed and interpreted by those paying close attention, the courtroom acting as both stage and arena for the subtle display of control, awareness, and preparedness. The soft, steady rhythm of her breath matched the gentle tap of a pen in the far corner, the ambient sounds coalescing into a tense backdrop that amplified the gravity of the silent confrontation. Alicia's eyes locked onto Officer Hanson once more, unwavering, her presence commanding and steady, radiating a calm certainty that the room could feel, a magnetic assertion of her control and authority over the delicate balance of the moment, and in that poised, deliberate stillness, the courtroom seemed to collectively recognize the power and composure she carried. The unspoken acknowledgement that the next shift in action was not only anticipated but entirely under her command. The room held a brittle silence, the kind that made every whispered thought seem amplified and every subtle movement magnified in significance. Alicia Brooks stood with unflinching composure, her hands lightly resting on the edge of the witness stand, the polished wood cool beneath her fingertips. She tilted her head ever so slightly, a calculated gesture that conveyed awareness without the need for words, a quiet assertion of control that radiated outward to every person in the courtroom. Officer Greg Hanson's eyes shifted nervously, darting briefly toward the audience and back to Alicia, the tension in his shoulders betraying the unease he was struggling to mask. The sunlight continued to filter through the high windows, cutting across the polished floor in long streaks, illuminating the subtle movements of everyone present and highlighting the contrast between the calm authority of Alicia and the restless energy of Hanson. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped loosely atop the bench, observing with a faint lift of the brow, while the gavel remained still, a silent witness to the mounting anticipation. Alicia's gaze swept across the room again, noting the smallest gestures of the spectators, a shift of weight, a nervous glance, a hand fidgeting with a notepad, each subtle cue building a map of awareness that she held firmly in her mind. Her posture was impeccable, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, a steadying presence that seemed to anchor the space around her, sending a signal that she was in full command of the moment. The officer shifted on his feet, the sound of leather brushing against the hardwood floor soft yet pronounced, a physical echo of his inner uncertainty. Alicia's eyes caught the fleeting glances exchanged between the spectators and the clerks, micro-expressions of curiosity, apprehension, and intrigue, all converging on the tension at the center of the room. She moved her hand along the edge of the stand in a controlled, deliberate motion, the subtle gesture drawing attention without breaking her composure, a testament to the precision and care with which she carried herself. The ambient sounds of the courtroom, the shuffle of papers, the faint tapping of shoes, the distant hum of the ventilation, interwove with the silent tension, creating a soundtrack of anticipation that underscored every calculated movement. Officer Hanson exhaled, a slow, measured breath that seemed louder than necessary, a sound that only accentuated the quiet dominance emanating from Alicia. Every detail mattered, the slight tilt of her head, the adjustment of her blazer, the calm measurement of each step, each microgesture resonating with unspoken authority. The spectators leaned subtly forward, drawn by the silent choreography of attention and awareness, each person subconsciously acknowledging the control Alicia wielded without the need for words or overt action. The sun moved imperceptibly higher, shifting the patterns of light across the courtroom and highlighting the polished surfaces and subtle shadows that mirrored the quiet tension. Alicia's gaze remained steady, meeting Hanson's eyes directly, unyielding and composed, radiating a quiet confidence that seemed to ripple through the room and settle over everyone present. The faintest smile, barely noticeable, touched her lips, conveying assurance and readiness, signaling that every eventuality had been anticipated and accounted for. The room, attentive and still, seemed to bend subtly toward her presence. Every person attuned to the silent power, the meticulous awareness, and the unshakable composure that Alicia maintained, transforming the courtroom into a stage where anticipation and observation were as tangible as the polished wood beneath their feet. The weight of the moment pressed outward, filling the space with a charged energy that all could sense, yet none could fully articulate, a silent understanding that the balance of attention and authority was firmly, undeniably, and quietly held by Alicia Brooks, poised and resolute. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted imperceptibly, an almost electric stillness settling over every observer as if the very air had thickened, carrying the weight of anticipation and the unspoken understanding that something pivotal was about to unfold. Alicia Brooks adjusted her posture slightly, her hands resting gently on the smooth surface of the witness stand, the polished wood cool beneath her fingertips and grounding her presence. Officer Greg Hanson's unease became more apparent with each measured breath, the subtle tightening of his jaw and the slight narrowing of his eyes betraying the careful calculation behind his outward composure. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, tracing patterns across the floor, illuminating the precise contours of the space, and casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to mirror the tension between the two figures at the center of attention. Alicia's eyes scanned the room, noting every minuscule gesture, the way spectators shifted in their seats, the faint tapping of fingers on benches, and the almost imperceptible movements of the court officers as they leaned forward, drawn by the growing intensity of the silent confrontation. Each subtle shift in her stance conveyed authority without aggression, a mastery of presence that seemed to ripple through the space, touching every witness and onlooker without a single word being spoken. Officer Hanson adjusted his stance again, shifting weight from one foot to the other, his polished shoes squeaking softly against the hardwood, the sound amplified by the tense hush that had fallen over the room. Alicia's gaze held him in place, unwavering, a controlled focus that seemed to fill the space around her, anchoring the attention of all present and heightening the sense of poised expectation. The judge observed quietly, hands resting lightly on the bench, eyes tracking the subtle interplay of expressions and gestures, while the gavel lay inert, a silent witness to the tension that had built to an almost palpable crescendo. The murmurs of the audience faded entirely, replaced by the soft, ambient sounds of the courtroom. The faint shuffle of papers, the soft hum of the ventilation system, the subtle creak of benches as spectators leaned forward slightly, all underscoring the deliberate and controlled energy that Alicia radiated. Each detail mattered, from the tilt of her head to the measured placement of her hands, every movement conveying confidence, readiness, and anticipation. Officer Hanson's eyes darted briefly to the windows, the polished floor, and back to Alicia, as if seeking a foothold in the unshakable certainty she projected. The sun continued its slow climb, casting warm beams across the room, highlighting the polished surfaces and the faint glint in Alicia's eyes, a quiet testament to her awareness and preparedness. The spectators remained still, captivated by the subtle choreography of posture, gesture, and intent that played out before them, sensing the balance of attention and authority that rested entirely with Alicia. The air seemed to hum with quiet energy, every breath, every slight movement, every blink contributing to the collective awareness that something significant was poised to occur. Alicia's faint, controlled exhale, almost imperceptible, conveyed a deep-seated confidence, a silent message that she had anticipated every scenario, accounted for every variable, and remained entirely in command of the moment. The courtroom itself seemed to acknowledge her presence, the high ceilings, polished wood, and filtered sunlight acting as a canvas for the careful interplay of tension, observation, and poised authority. Officer Hanson's subtle shifts, the micro-expressions of spectators, and the quiet attention of the judge all converged into a singular focus on Alicia, whose calm, deliberate control of her presence shaped the entire dynamic of the room, holding the energy taut and the anticipation suspended, every participant attuned to the silent mastery of awareness, timing, and precision that she maintained as she prepared for the moment that would define the space and the perception of authority within it. Every movement in the courtroom seemed magnified, each slight shift of posture and gesture echoing across the polished wood and high ceilings, carrying weight far beyond their physical presence. Alicia Brooks remained poised, a figure of calm authority, her hands lightly touching the edges of the witness stand as if grounding herself and the room simultaneously, radiating control without a single word. Officer Greg Hanson's eyes darted repeatedly, catching glimpses of the spectators' faces, their subtle reactions, the tilt of their heads, the soft exhalations, all amplified in his awareness, highlighting his growing tension. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, slicing across the floor in long, warm beams, illuminating the polished surfaces and casting intricate shadows that danced lightly across the room, emphasizing the contrast between the composed, steady presence of Alicia and the restless uncertainty of the officer. The judge leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the bench, observing with quiet attention, the gavel lying unused but omnipresent, a silent reminder of authority and procedure. Alicia's eyes moved deliberately across the room, noting the small micro-expressions of the spectators, the subtle shuffling of feet, the barely audible rustle of papers, each detail registering and integrating into her mental map of the unfolding dynamics. Her posture remained impeccable, chin lifted slightly, shoulders back, projecting an unwavering sense of calm and measured authority that seemed to fill the space around her. Officer Hanson shifted, the polished leather of his shoes squeaking softly as he adjusted his weight, an audible signal of discomfort in the tense, anticipatory environment. Alicia allowed her eyes to follow these shifts carefully, each subtle cue reinforcing her understanding of the balance of power, the silent undercurrent of observation, and the collective anticipation that hung thick in the air. The courtroom, with its high ceilings, polished wood floors, and filtered sunlight, became a stage upon which tension and awareness played out in every micro-movement, every glance, and every subtle gesture. Spectators leaned slightly forward, collectively attuned to the nuanced display of poise, control, and readiness emanating from Alicia. Each person sensing the quiet energy that defined the room without a single spoken command. The faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional soft shuffle of paper punctuated the almost tangible silence, layering an auditory texture that emphasized the gravity and concentration of the moment. Alicia adjusted her stance minimally, a subtle movement that reinforced her grounding in the room, projecting both attentiveness and preparedness, a quiet dominance that was sensed by everyone present. Officer Hanson exhaled slowly, a careful breath that carried more weight than its sound, and Alicia's gaze met his steadily, unwavering, acknowledging without a hint of agitation, a silent affirmation that she had anticipated every eventuality. Light continued to filter through the windows, tracing the contours of the room and highlighting the meticulous arrangement of people and space, shadows falling in soft patterns that accentuated the silent drama unfolding. Each spectator became a witness not only to the tension between the two central figures, but also to the quiet mastery of presence, observation, and timing that Alicia maintained, her control of subtle movements, attention, and authority resonating through the room in a way that shaped the perception of every individual. The soft, controlled rhythm of her breath, the measured placement of her hands, the slight tilt of her head, and the deliberate pace of her stance coalesced into a visual and emotional cadence that held the attention of all present, sustaining anticipation and reinforcing the sense that the balance of awareness, readiness, and authority rested entirely with Alicia Brooks. Every subtle gesture, every nuanced look, every careful motion contributed to a collective understanding that the room itself had shifted, attuned to her composed presence, fully aware that the next phase of interaction was entirely guided by her poise and unshakable focus, creating an almost palpable energy that wrapped around the spectators, the officer, and even the judge, holding all in the delicate suspension of anticipation, awareness, and quiet command. The tension in the courtroom reached a subtle crescendo, each observer acutely aware of the controlled energy that had built over the preceding minutes. Alicia Brooks adjusted her stance with deliberate precision, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the polished witness stand, the cool surface grounding her as she projected calm authority. Officer Greg Hanson's movements became increasingly measured, a visible reflection of the inner calculation and rising awareness of the quiet dominance radiating from Alicia. Sunlight poured through the high windows, casting long, sharp lines across the hardwood floors, highlighting the deliberate spacing between the two figures and emphasizing the gravity of the silent standoff. Every seat in the courtroom seemed to lean in slightly, as if drawn by the magnetic presence of Alicia, whose posture, gestures, and controlled breathing conveyed a mastery of awareness and timing. The judge shifted slightly, adjusting his position and glancing down at documents with a faint lift of the brow, his attention now partially anchored to the subtle interplay of movement and intent between Alicia and Hanson. The spectators, previously whispering in cautious tones, had fallen into a hushed collective focus, eyes scanning the central figures for any indication of forthcoming action or revelation. Alicia's gaze moved with quiet deliberation, observing micro-expressions, fleeting glances, and subtle adjustments in posture throughout the room, integrating each detail into a precise mental map of the environment and its occupants. Officer Hanson's composure wavered imperceptibly as he registered the steadiness of her presence, each controlled movement, and each silent, deliberate gesture, reinforcing his growing recognition of her authority. The ambient sounds, the soft hum of ventilation, the faint shuffle of papers, the gentle scraping of shoe soles on polished wood, served as a subtle underscore, amplifying the tension and drawing attention to every measured movement within the room. Alicia shifted, her weight slightly, a barely perceptible motion, yet it resonated through the observers, projecting quiet assurance and readiness, and reinforcing the unspoken message that she anticipated every possible scenario. Shadows cast by the sunlight elongated and moved subtly across the room, mirroring the measured, deliberate pacing of attention and observation that defined the atmosphere, accentuating the quiet drama unfolding without any overt confrontation. The audience remained completely attuned to the subtle choreography of posture, gaze, and gesture, sensing the controlled energy radiating from Alicia and acknowledging, in silent recognition, the balance of awareness, timing, and preparedness she commanded. Officer Hanson's eyes flicked repeatedly, noting details of light, space, and spectator reactions, each shift reinforcing the awareness of the meticulous focus she maintained. The polished wood of the witness stand caught reflections of sunlight, the glint accentuating Alicia's poised movements, further amplifying the perception of her unshakable presence and control. Every subtle shift, every deliberate microgesture, every steady breath coalesced into a rhythmic pattern of authority that the room felt viscerally, without any spoken affirmation, leaving spectators, officers, and even the judge acutely conscious that the balance of attention and influence rested entirely in Alicia's poised composure. The ambient light, the polished surfaces, the faint echoes of movement, and the focused attention of every observer converged into a cohesive atmosphere of anticipation and respect for the measured mastery that Alicia projected, the room collectively suspended in a state of heightened awareness and subtle acknowledgement of the quiet yet undeniable authority she embodied. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath collectively as the subtle shift in energy unfolded, a quiet anticipation vibrating through the polished floors and high ceilings. Every observer caught between expectation and astonishment. Alicia Brooks remained composed, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the witness stand, the smooth wood grounding her as she radiated a controlled confidence that seemed to fill the room without a single spoken word. Officer Greg Hanson's posture stiffened imperceptibly, the slight tightening of his shoulders and the careful placement of his hands signaling the silent acknowledgement of the authority radiating from her presence. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows fell across the hardwood floor in long, angled beams, illuminating the fine details of the room. The polished surfaces, the subtle glints of light on the spectator's eyes, the intricate patterns of shadows stretching across the benches, all reinforcing the charged stillness that enveloped the space. Alicia's eyes moved deliberately across the room, noting every micro-expression, every subtle shift in weight, every flicker of curiosity or apprehension, integrating each detail into a comprehensive awareness that guided her stance and her interactions. The judge leaned slightly forward, adjusting his papers with a faint lift of the brow, aware of the tension yet maintaining a composed neutrality, his gavel lying still as the silent orchestration of attention and authority continued. The murmurs that had once moved softly through the room were now replaced by a hushed collective focus, the audience attuned to the delicate choreography of presence, gaze, and movement at the center of the courtroom. Alicia shifted her weight slightly, a deliberate adjustment that projected calm assurance and readiness, her posture steady, her chin lifted slightly, shoulders back, radiating an unshakable poise. Officer Hanson's gaze flicked rapidly from Alicia to the spectators and back again, a subtle reflection of the mental calculation and recognition of her control over the environment. The soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional shuffle of paper punctuated the quiet, amplifying the awareness of every measured movement, every controlled gesture, every calculated pause that Alicia executed with precise timing. Light continued to filter through the upper windows, casting long shadows and highlighting the deliberate spacing and positioning of the figures in the room, accentuating the silent tension and careful orchestration of presence. The spectators, now leaning forward slightly, absorbed the subtle mastery of observation, awareness, and composure displayed by Alicia, sensing the balance of authority, attention, and anticipation that rested entirely in her deliberate and poised control. Every subtle motion, every slight tilt of the head, every careful breath contributed to a rhythm of quiet command, a flow of energy that the room felt viscerally, with each observer recognizing the measured power without any overt demonstration. The polished surfaces, filtered sunlight, and attentive presence of all in the room combined to form an almost tangible atmosphere of anticipation and respect, each participant keenly aware that the moment was balanced on the poised awareness, controlled composure, and quiet authority that Alicia maintained. Her faint, controlled exhale, almost imperceptible, reinforced the sense of complete readiness, an unspoken assertion that she had anticipated every scenario, accounted for every variable, and held the room's attention and expectation firmly within the scope of her calm mastery. Officer Hanson's subtle shifts, the micro-responses of the audience, and the quiet attentiveness of the judge all merged into a single, sustained awareness that the balance of influence and perception in the courtroom was decisively and elegantly guided by Alicia Brooks, her presence shaping every detail and motion within the space, holding the energy of the room in a deliberate suspension of attention, anticipation, and unspoken authority. The tension that had gripped the courtroom for what felt like hours began to shift, subtle yet undeniable, as Alicia Brooks maintained her unwavering presence, each measured breath and deliberate gesture reinforcing the quiet authority she carried. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows in soft, golden beams, illuminating the polished wood floors and casting long, angular shadows that seemed to stretch toward the corners of the room, emphasizing the space between the figures and the weight of the silent attention that filled it. Officer Greg Hanson adjusted his stance repeatedly, the slight creak of his shoes against the floor amplifying the sense of unease that radiated from him, each micro-movement a reflection of his growing recognition of the control Alicia exerted over the space. The spectators remained poised, leaning slightly forward, eyes wide with anticipation, their collective focus drawn entirely to the subtle interactions between Alicia and the officer, absorbing every shift of posture, every faint flicker of the eyes, and every careful movement that spoke volumes without a single spoken word. The judge observed quietly, hands resting lightly on the bench, occasionally adjusting papers while maintaining an impartial, composed demeanor, the gavel resting untouched as the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Alicia shifted slightly, a small but deliberate adjustment of weight that projected both readiness and calm assurance, a signal that she had anticipated every possible scenario and was fully in control of her environment. The faint hum of the ventilation system and the soft shuffle of paper provided a gentle rhythm to the otherwise charged silence, highlighting the contrast between ambient noise and the deliberate stillness that defined the central figures. Light continued to play across the polished surfaces, accentuating the contours of the room and the poised presence of Alicia, each reflection and shadow enhancing the perception of her mastery and awareness. Officer Hanson's gaze moved quickly, scanning the room, and then returning to Alicia, the subtle flickers of movement betraying the careful calculations running through his mind as he realized the depth of her preparedness and the firmness of her composure. The audience responded unconsciously, leaning in as if drawn by an invisible thread, their attention fully captured by the rhythm of observation, subtle gestures, and quiet control that Alicia maintained, a silent display of authority that resonated through every corner of the space. Alicia's breathing remained steady, controlled, her shoulders relaxed yet firm, every small movement deliberate, projecting assurance and preparedness, a mastery of timing, awareness, and perception that anchored the energy of the room. The soft ambient light, the polished wood, the attentive faces of the spectators, and the subtle presence of the judge coalesced into an atmosphere of heightened focus, anticipation, and quiet acknowledgement of the authority that Alicia embodied. Every subtle microgesture, each slight tilt of the head, each measured movement contributed to the collective recognition that the balance of attention, control, and influence rested entirely with her, and the room seemed to hum with the silent understanding that she had anticipated every eventuality, accounted for every variable, and held the perception of authority firmly within her grasp. The polished edges of the witness stand caught glimmers of sunlight, reflecting faint patterns across the floor, further emphasizing the deliberate spacing, the poised stance, and the silent command that Alicia radiated. As the minutes stretched, the anticipation held taut. The room itself seemed suspended in a delicate equilibrium, every observer, every participant fully aware that the quiet mastery, composed presence, and unshakable focus of Alicia Brooks defined the flow, attention, and energy of the courtroom, marking the culmination of preparation, awareness, and control in a space that had become both a stage and a reflection of deliberate authority.